Thornley Green, Christmas Eve, 1952. The winter of 1952 had arrived early in the English countryside, carrying with it a chill that seemed less seasonal and more declarative, an icy punctuation mark to a year already thick with unease. The village of Thornley Green, nestled between rolling downs and meandering streams, was the sort of place that postcards attempted but rarely captured. Its lanes curved gently like old handwriting, bordered by hawthorn hedges now spangled with frost. Cottages leaned companionably toward one another, as though exchanging confidential murmurs about the weather, the price of coal, and, more reliably, the affairs of their neighbours. At the northern edge of the parish stood Briarstone Manor, an estate that had presided over the village for generations, built of warm grey stone and softened by time into a stately dignity. In summer it was impressive, in winter theatrical. Snow now clung to its turrets and ledges like lace to a gown. The yew trees lining the drive stood dark and sentry, still, bearing their white burdens solemnly. The great oak door was framed by a festive wreath. Holly, ivy, and ribbons of bantry fell green, yet even this touch of Christmas cheer could not quite dispel the impression that the house itself was quietly bracing for something other than merriment. Inside, the manor was a sanctuary of mid-century country comfort. Fires crackled in deep hearths, and the air was warmed by pine boughs, beeswax polish, and the faint spice of cloves simmering somewhere in the kitchen. The walls were hung with ancestral portraits, landscapes, and hunting scenes, their gilt frames gleaming in the firelight. In the long gallery to the west, known simply as the West Gallery, garlands of fir were draped along the banister of the staircase, twined with glass ornaments that glimmered like frozen fruit. The gallery itself had been partially repurposed as an art space for the winter months, leased by its present occupant, Mr. Jasper Roth, a gentleman of wealth, vanity, and a certain flamboyant discretion. The house party, assembled by Colonel Arthur Bantry, Fell, the manor's owner, was intended to be Thornley Green's social crescendo of the season. The Colonel, a retired officer of genial manners and a voice still calibrated for parade grounds, believed fervently in hospitality, tradition, and charitable morale, boosting, particularly in December. He was tall, silver-haired, and equipped with a moustache that suggested diplomacy and tweed. Though he moved through his home like a man accustomed to command, his eyes were warm and slightly absent, betraying a trusting nature that left the manoeuvring of subtler matters to others. His guests for the Christmas festivities had arrived in stages throughout the afternoon, delivered by motor car, village gossip, and varying degrees of personal anticipation. First came Edmund Hawthorne, the Colonel's ward and presumptive heir. Hawthorne was a handsome man in his early 40s, with a posture of studied courtesy and a mouth that could be charming or thin, depending on the audience. His inheritance of Briarstone was widely understood as an eventuality, though perhaps not a certainty, for the Colonel had always spoken of legacies in tones of sentimental philosophy rather than legal precision. Edmund, for his part, wore his expectation of ownership lightly, but like a tailored waistcoat, close to the heart, measured to fit, and impossible to misplace. Close on his heels, figuratively, if not emotionally, was his wife, Clara Hawthorne, a woman of poised elegance and seasonal perfection. Clara embodied Christmas the way snow embodied winter, naturally, attractively, and without effort. Her hair was styled into glossy waves, pinned discreetly for the cold. She wore pearls at tea, though it was still daylight, and moved through rooms as though accompanied by faint choral music. Yet beneath her polished serenity lay a sharper intelligence than she revealed. The villagers admired her, the servants deferred to her, and her husband, well, her husband managed her. Next arrived Dr. Lydia Carrington, the family physician and long-time acquaintance of the Bantry Fell household. Dr. Carrington was a modern woman by 1950 standards, professional, calm, and impeccably precise. She wore practicality like armour, yet without the faintest clank. Her eyes were bright and alert, her shoes sensible, and her manner one of intelligent containment. The Colonel relied upon her medical judgment, and, though he did not articulate it, her ability to interpret the emotional temperature of a room. She was a woman who kept secrets not by hoarding them, but by never appearing to notice them in the first place. The fourth guest, Iris Fletcher, was the village schoolmistress, young, earnest, and possessed of an inquisitive gaze that belied her youth. At 29, she had not yet learned the advantage of invisibility, nor the art of polite misdirection. She was invited less for her social position, and more for her generous heart. She had organized the children's Christmas choir, and the Colonel had insisted she must spend Christmas Eve, where the mince pies were plentiful and the fires warm. Iris, grateful and slightly overwhelmed, arrived in a woolen coat 2 sizes too large, carrying handmade ornaments from her pupils, and the indefinable air of someone who would one day witness something she wished she hadn't. The fifth guest was already present, Mr. Jasper Roth, who had been leasing the West Gallery for private art curation. Roth was a tall man with dramatic eyebrows and an accent that danced between cosmopolitan and deliberately opaque. He was wealthy enough to be eccentric without explanation, and eccentric enough to require none. He spoke with a faint cadence of performance, as though narrating his own life to an invisible audience. Though not local, he had taken temporary residence at Briarstone for the winter, installing his collection in the gallery while quietly researching a particular painting of interest, an ancestral portrait colloquially titled The Winter Queen. Last to arrive, though in truth the first to observe it all, was Miss Jane Marple, who came by train from London, then by village taxi that rattled amiably through Thornley Green like a gossip tin on wheels. She was 78, with soft white hair tucked beneath a practical felt hat, eyes that absorbed details like blotting paper absorbed ink, and hands that could knit lace while unravelling lies. She had been invited as a courtesy to a late correspondence between herself and the Colonel's deceased wife, a connection remote enough to be polite, yet close enough to justify a suitcase. She stepped into the Manor shortly before 4 o'clock, greeted by the Colonel himself. "Miss Marple, how splendid you could come!" he boomed, ushering her inside with both hands extended, as though guiding a ship into harbour. "You are very kind, Colonel," she replied, smiling faintly. "It is such a pleasure to see the countryside at Christmas. Snow does improve one's view of roofs, does it not? Makes everything look less gossiped upon." The Colonel chuckled heartily at that, assuming it to be a seasonal jest. He relieved her of her coat and directed her to the drawing-room, where tea was already under way. Miss Marple took in the room in one slow sweep, the placement of teacups, the uneven height of stocking labels above the hearth, the tension in Clara Hawthorne's fingers as she lifted a pie, the doctor's silent recalibration of the Colonel's anecdote, the 2 still eyes of Jasper Roth, and bright, untrained curiosity of Iris Fletcher. Ah, yes, she thought, though the thought never appeared upon her face, a house full of secrets is like a pudding full of plums. One is never quite sure where the stones lie until someone bites down. The spark before the flame, the afternoon passed in polite conversation and seasonal ritual. The Colonel reminisced about wartime Christmases, his voice thick with nostalgic honour. Edmund Hawthorne praised the Manor's festive preparations with careful enthusiasm, while Clara admired the ornaments on the gallery staircase with almost proprietary approval. Dr. Carrington drank tea quietly, measuring each sentence she heard, but offering few of her own. Roth contributed theatrical observations about the village's winter beauty, though he avoided detail when asked about his work. Iris Fletcher, meanwhile, spoke animatedly of the children's choir and the handmade ornaments they had crafted, one of which she hung upon the tree herself, slightly askew. Miss Marple knitted. Knitting was her disguise, her meditation, her truth serum. A woman who knits listens twice, once with her ears, once with the thread. By 6 o'clock snow pressed more insistently against the windows. The sky beyond had turned the colour of slate dipped in ink. The drawing-room hummed with the warm crackle of fire and human performance. And then came the scream. It was sharp, breathless, and unpolished. The sound of someone encountering a truth too large to carry. "I think he's dead." Iris Fletcher stood at the gallery door, her face blanched of its usual colour, eyes huge and shining like winter ponds. One hand clutched the door-frame, the other trembled toward the stairs. Chairs scraped, teacups rattled. The Colonel surged to his feet with startled authority, and Edmund and Clara followed, exchanging a glance that was swift, unreadable, and entirely non-seasonal. Dr. Carrington rose calmly but quickly, already stepping forward. Roth, who had been warming his hands by the fire, turned sharply, and the room seemed to watch his face rather than Iris's gesture. Miss Marple set down her knitting. Not hurriedly, she never hurried, but with the deliberate finality of someone closing a book at the end of a chapter that ought not have been written at all. The body at the bottom of the stairs, the west gallery, was colder than the rest of the house, not unheated, but emotionally wintered. The long staircase descended from the upper gallery to the tiled floor below, bordered by garlands strung with ornaments. One of them, a red glass bauble, had fallen and shattered at the base, and there, half-wreck, lined as though bowing to his own tragedy, lay Jasper Roth. One arm stretched outward, fingers splayed toward the broken ornament like a man reaching for a metaphor. His head rested at an unnatural angle. There was no blood, no struggle, no visible violence, only the eerie stillness of a man whose final movement had been mistaken for decoration. Dr. Carrington knelt beside him and placed 2 fingers to his neck. The silence that followed was thick, expectant, and entirely fatal. "He is dead," she said. The Colonel exhaled sharply. Iris gasped. Clara lifted a gloved hand to her mouth. Edmund said nothing at all. Roth had fallen, but not as a man falls by accident, rather as a man falls when someone else has written gravity into the script. Miss Marple did not kneel. She did not need to. She merely looked, truly looked, at the body, the stairs, the shattered ornament, and the faces watching the scene unfold. Christmas Eve, she thought, the season for gifts. How curious that someone has chosen to deliver truth wrapped as tragedy. The aftermath of sudden death, even in a house wreathed for Christmas, unfolds with a peculiar choreography. Shock comes first, swift and instinctive, then confusion, which lingers like perfume too heavy for the room. Finally, composure, never evenly distributed and seldom sincere. At Briarstone Manor, composure arrived wearing a doctor's shoes and a constable's boots. P.C. Hugh Nolan, Thornley Green's local policeman, entered the manor at 7:40, 5 on Christmas Eve, snow dusting his helmet and eyelashes, cheeks flushed with the cold and the uneasy awareness that a tragedy of rank had unfolded under his jurisdiction. He was young, 27, and carried the earnest diligence of a man still hopeful that rules, properly applied, would solve most problems. Murder, he had always assumed, was the province of larger towns, darker nights, and professionals with notebooks thicker than his own. The gallery scene was preserved exactly as he found it, at Miss Marple's suggestion, offered not as direction, but conversational reflection. People move instinctively when distressed, she had murmured to Dr. Carrington. And instinct is dreadfully careless with evidence. The doctor had agreed, instructing the maid not to sweep the stairs despite the glittering temptation of broken glass. Now P.C. Nolan surveyed the tableau, the body, the stairs, the shattered ornament, the unbroken banister, the draped garlands, and the faces hovering above it like chapters waiting to be read. He cleared his throat. "Terrible business, this, yes," said Miss Marple, seated on a small gallery bench, knitting calmly once more. "Though terrible is such an elastic word, don't you think? It stretches to fit whatever one wishes to conceal." P.C. Nolan blinked at that. He thought it best filed under eccentricity. Initial observations the constable began methodically. Roth had indeed died from a fall, according to the immediate evidence. No sign of struggle, no forced grip on the railing, no foreign prints on the banister. The tiles beneath him were hard and unyielding. The stairs were wide, shallow, and polished but not treacherous. A person could fall there, certainly, but one would need a reason, imbalance, faintness, haste, or misfortune. Was Mr. Roth in good health? Nolan asked. He was perfectly hale, the colonel insisted, fit enough to prowl that gallery at all hours. Prowl, Miss Marple echoed mildly, without looking up from her needles. Such an interesting verb, cats prowl, collectors, stalk. Edmund Hawthorne's eyes flicked to her. The flick was brief, but Miss Marple caught it anyway, without appearing to. Interview one Colonel Bantry. The colonel was interviewed first in his study, which smelled of leather, pipe smoke, and polished self-belief. He described Roth as a winter tenant, an art connoisseur installing his collection in the gallery. Roth had expressed admiration for the ancestral portrait known as the Winter Queen, currently undergoing restoration in the west alcove. Did he have disputes with anyone here? Nolan asked. Good heavens, no. The colonel exclaimed. Roth was the soul of conviviality. Convivial souls rarely threaten inheritances. Miss Marple later remarked quietly to no one in particular. The colonel did not hear it. P.C. Nolan did. He frowned faintly. Inheritance? Oh yes, she said, tone light as tinsel. Large houses always have one, you know, and when there is an inheritance, there is mathematics, and where there is mathematics, there is motive. Nolan made a mental note. It was the first note that felt like weight. Interview 2, Edmund Hawthorne. Edmund received Nolan in the morning room at 8:30, posture immaculate, expression seasonally sombre. He admitted Roth had mentioned an uncomfortable discovery about the estate earlier that week, but claimed ignorance of detail. What sort of discovery? Nolan pressed. Hawthorne's smile was thin and politely evasive. Roth enjoyed dramatic turns of phrase. I assumed it concerned provenance of some artwork. Miss Marple later recalled his fingers were steady, but his breathing fractionally delayed when he said provenance. A man afraid of losing art is one thing. A man afraid of losing land is quite another. Interview 3, Clara Hawthorne. Clara spoke to the constable beside the Christmas tree, one hand resting on a branch as though drawing strength from its uncomplaining silence. She recalled Roth had argued with Dr. Carrington that afternoon, words sharp but context unclear. She herself had intervened only to restore civility. Civility, Miss Marple thought, is the camouflage of conflict. Clara also confirmed Roth always took 2 spoons of sugar in his tea, except at their drawing-room tea on Christmas Eve, when he had pointedly declined it. "That is curious," Nolan said. "Yes," said Miss Marple, appearing at his elbow like a helpful ghost of observation, "particularly as the rest of us drank from the same tray, only his cup was prepared separately on account of a supposed dietary request, a request he never made." The maid confirmed later, "A forged preference is a marvellous way to deliver poison disguised as kindness. Interview for Dr. Lydia Carrington. The doctor's interview was the most precise and least revealing." She acknowledged the disagreement, though not its substance. "What did you quarrel about?" Nolan asked. "Ethics," she replied. "Confidentiality, professional obligations." "Oh, yes," Miss Marple mused afterward. "The sort of quarrel one has when someone else holds your secrets by the throat." Nolan's pen paused mid-air. "Secrets," she smiled faintly. "Doctors collect more than symptoms, Constable." The doctor had also insisted the painting was not relevant to Roth's death, which, Miss Marple thought, was rather like insisting a storm was unrelated to thunder. Interview 5 Iris Fletcher Iris was interviewed last. Soft, spoken, shaken, but thoughtful. She had found Roth already collapsed, moments after hearing a thud. She denied touching the banister or moving the body, though admitted to retrieving a letter from the floor near his hand before the doctor arrived. "What letter?" Nolan asked quickly. "It looked personal," she said hesitantly. "I thought perhaps a note he wished concealed." "You concealed it yourself?" he asked. "I put it in his desk drawer. I meant no harm." Miss Marple nodded kindly at that. "Young people believe privacy is protection. Older people know it is opportunity." The letter, retrieved later by P.C. Nolan, was unsigned, written in a hand that attempted neutrality and failed. "You have until Boxing Day. I know the truth about the Winter Queen. Pay what is owed, or Briarstone will no longer be yours." A threat. A debt, a deadline, and most notably, a promise to expose theft. The painting was the centre, the motive was present, the poison, though not yet confirmed, was already implied. Miss Marple reflects the manor stirred to life on Christmas Day, with festive rituals somewhat dampened, though not extinguished. The village, however, was already alight with speculation, whispered over pews, goose fat, and holly sprigs. Miss Marple sat by the gallery fire that afternoon, considering the evidence with gentle certainty. Human behaviour, she had always found, was more consistent than alibis, and far less imaginative than lies. She observed that Roth was investigating stolen art. Someone feared exposure. The threat targeted inheritance. The cup was prepared separately. The sugar was declined. The doctor knew something she wished she didn't. The ward feared something he claimed he didn't. Christmas had delivered its tragedy not as an accident, but a message, and messages, Miss Marple knew, are always sent by someone who wishes to be read eventually. Christmas Day at Briarstone Manor dawned bright and deceptively tranquil, the sort of winter morning that suggested innocence by sheer beauty. Snow glittered on the lawns, crisp and untrodden, save for a single wandering trail left by a fox who had clearly not received the invitation list. The sky was pale blue, rinsed clean of clouds. Inside, however, the atmosphere was less pristine. Suspicion, once admitted, does not politely wait in the hall. It settles in armchairs, sips tea uninvited, and asks inconvenient questions of its own. The poison confirmed shortly after 10 o'clock. Dr. Carrington requested the kitchen be closed for necessary inquiries, and summoned P.C. Nolan to the still, sealed west gallery, the doctor carried a small leather case that was not her usual medical bag. Its clasps clicked open with clinical finality. I examined Mr. Roth more thoroughly once the initial distress had passed. She said, "The fall caused his death, certainly, but it was not the origin of his collapse." Nolan frowned. "Then what did?" She withdrew a tiny glass vial, empty but for a dusting of residue, cyanide compound, dissolved, likely administered in tea. The constable's face drained of colour. "You're certain?" "As certain as one can be without laboratory analysis," she replied. "Which I will conduct in London tomorrow, though I doubt the science will contradict what is already clear." Miss Marple, who had arrived quietly behind them, observed the vial with polite interest, but no surprise at all. "Such compounds have a distinct scent," she remarked. "One rarely forgets bitter almonds once one has had cause to remember them." Dr. Carrington's eyes narrowed slightly, not in disagreement, but calculation. She was used to diagnosing bodies, not conversations. Miss Marple diagnosed both. The gallery staircase was inspected again, this time not for slipperiness but staging. The garlands had been carefully fixed with florist's wire, yet one section sagged by a quarter, inch near the banister's midpoint. A glint of gold caught Miss Marple's eye. Something caught in the greenery above. With a request that sounded entirely like an observation, she said, "Might someone taller than I be so kind as to retrieve that for us?" Nolan obliged, rising on the bottom step and tugging the branch downward. A small object dropped into his palm, a monogrammed cuff-link, J. R. Jasper Roth, his own. Edmund said later, when shown the link, or placed to appear his own. Miss Marple thought privately. Shifting suspicions, the suspects were many, the motives varied, the truths reluctant. At luncheon, conversation was sparse, brittle, and performatively reverent. The colonel attempted joviality and failed. Even goodwill cannot out. Boom a murder investigation. Edmund and Clara sat opposite one another, polite strangers playing married hosts. Roth's empty chair at the table exerted a peculiar influence, like a portrait with its subject rubbed out. Miss Marple listened more than she spoke. The best clues, she knew, were not always spoken aloud. Often they were avoided entirely. The village telephone rang repeatedly that afternoon with well-wishing inquiries, seasonal greetings, and artless curiosity. Each call was intercepted by the housekeeper, Mrs. Grafton, a woman whose loyalty was ironclad, her posture rigid, and her opinions silent until pressed. Miss Marple pressed gently, "Mrs. Grafton, do tell me, who prepared Mr. Roth's teacup yesterday?" "I did," she replied. "He asked for saccharin, said sugar disagreed with him, but it never has before." Iris Fletcher interjected later. The maid, Tilly, confirmed the same. Roth always took sugar, 2 spoons, no exceptions. He once sent tea back for insufficient sweetness. A preference suddenly changed is either health or disguise, but disguise, Miss Marple knew, is rarely self-authored. Someone else had written Roth's preferences for him. Red Herring one, the painting theft, the restoration of the Winter Queen, became the first irresistible suspect of motive. Roth had hired a London restorer, Mr. Pell, who arrived at noon on Christmas Day, breathless, snowy, and affronted at the notion his work might be incidental. I was told a signature had been uncovered beneath the paint, and Nolan said. "Yes," Pell exclaimed, "a hidden mark, belonging to a Flemish master whose works disappeared during the war. Roth was obsessed with it. Obsessions are useful, Miss Marple observed later, particularly to those who borrow them. If the painting was stolen, the Hawthorns' inheritance might dissolve into scandal. This led naturally to Edmund Hawthorne, who had most to lose. yet who insisted he knew nothing at all. Nothing, however, is a large territory to defend. Red herring to Iris's letter interference, next suspicion swerved sharply toward Iris Fletcher, who had concealed a letter found near Roth's hand. You moved evidence, and all unwarned. I protected privacy, she corrected, voice wavering but principled. I thought it personal, and so it was, Miss Marple noted, but personal letters are also leverage, my dear. The letter contained blackmail threats regarding the painting. Iris had inadvertently preserved the motive while concealing the handwriting. The mistake was human, but the crime was intentional. Iris, perceptive but guileless, was a red herring dipped in honesty. Red herring 3, Dr. Carrington's professional silence. Then there was the doctor. Clara insisted Roth had argued with Dr. Carrington at tea about secrets, ethics, and obligations. The doctor acknowledged the dispute but denied relevance. A denial, Miss Marple noted, is a fascinating sort of clue. It reveals shape by refusing to occupy it. Carrington was a woman of rigid promises, which made her the perfect keeper of old loyalties and, possibly, old crimes. A new clue raises the stakes that evening, while the Manor's guests attempted the ritual of Christmas carols in the hall, voices carefully distinct in their various degrees of seasonal enthusiasm. Tilly the maid found something tucked beneath the gallery carpet near the base of the stairs, a small brass key, unlabelled but unmistakably old. The Colonel recognized it immediately. The East Tower desk, he said, belonged to my late cousin, Gerald. No one's used it in years, except perhaps someone who fears old secrets being opened. Miss Marple murmured. The tower desk, when unlocked, revealed a hidden compartment containing old estate documents, wartime transport receipts, and one envelope, sealed, monogrammed, BF inside, a photograph, Roth standing beside the Winter Queen, weeks earlier, holding a teacup in the very gallery where he later fell. On the back, a note in different handwriting. If he inherits, we all lose. A new player, a new motive, a new threat. The stakes were no longer merely art theft or blackmail. They were inheritance, ruin, and intention. Christmas had wrapped its clues neatly, but murder, Miss Marple knew, always comes with tags, and it was time to read the handwriting on them. The evening after Christmas Day at Briarstone Manor passed under a sky sharp with stars and brittle with cold. Indoors the fires burned steadily, but the warmth they offered felt physical rather than emotional. Suspicion, once roused, alters a household's rhythm. Conversations become shorter, silences longer, and even the ticking of clocks seems invested with opinion. Miss Jane Marple, who had spent a lifetime observing the cadences of human nature, found this shift instructive rather than unsettling. She had retired early to her small but comfortable room in the south wing, yet sleep eluded her, not from agitation, but from the gentle insistence of thought assembling itself into pattern. The clues, laid before her like threads awaiting a knitter's design, were abundant now. A death precipitated by poison, staged as a fall, a forged dietary preference, a letter of blackmail concealed by well-meaning hands. A missing gallery lease, a key belonging to a tower desk long thought dormant, a photograph linking Roth to the scene weeks before, and a note that whispered motive in a voice that refused attribution. If he inherits, we all lose. The final clue had shifted the ground beneath their feet. This was no longer a simple matter of theft, extortion, or brittle loyalties. This was about succession, the most dangerous word in any old house. Miss Marple set her knitting aside on the bedside table, an unusual gesture, for knitting was how she listened to the world. But tonight the world was speaking too loudly to require disguise. A village memory illuminates the present. Her mind wandered, as it often did, to the parallels of village life, microcosms of larger crimes. She recalled a particular Christmas many years earlier in St. Mary Mead, when the fate of a parish silver collection had turned on something as small as a missing key and as large as inherited pride. The culprit in that instance had not been the person who stood to gain, but the one who feared being made small by someone else's assent. Fear, she thought, is a more reliable motive than greed. Greed hopes. Fear plans, which made her reconsider the players with fresh focus. Edmund hoped, Clara feared, the doctor promised, Iris protected, the colonel reminisced, and Wrath had known too much too theatrically. Yet the house itself knew more than all of them. Old houses always do. Inspecting what was not said, Miss Marple had always trusted negative space. The things unsaid, unasked, or too quickly dismissed. Clara Hawthorne, for example, had intervened in the tea dispute only to restore civility, she claimed, yet she had also been the one to insist the fire was perfect when the temperature of the room was clearly divided. A woman who polices warmth also polices atmosphere. Dr. Carrington had spoken of ethics and obligations, but not the direction of those obligations. Secrets are not incriminating by existence, only by allegiance. Iris had hidden the blackmail letter, yet not the handwriting. If she feared the letter was personal, she would have hidden it more completely. Edmund had most to lose in terms of inheritance, but loss is different from prevention. Losing a future is not the same as stopping it, and the tower key, why hide it beneath the carpet? Whoever concealed it wanted discovery delayed, not denied. Delay buys time. Denial invites questions. Murder prefers time. The lease papers, the missing gallery, lease gnawed at her gently persistent mind. If Wrath planned to stay through winter, why carry a Boxing Day ticket to London? Because he intended departure. But departure is rarely sudden without leverage, which meant he planned to leave because the threat was real. Threats become real only when someone believes them. Miss Marple did not yet know who the threat targeted, but she knew who feared belief itself. A promise once extracted is no longer silence, but a hostage situation. A confrontation foreseen the next morning, Boxing Day. She requested that breakfast be served earlier than planned. P.C. Nolan, eager to assist without quite knowing why, found her already waiting in the gallery with a cup of tea untouched and cooling. "You wished to examine the tower desk again?" he asked. "Not the desk," she said. The people who believe desks keep secrets better than people do. She asked Nolan to gather the guests for a post-breakfast stroll on the manor grounds. Suggesting fresh air would revive spirits. Spirits were not what she intended to revive. Outdoors, snow-muffled footsteps and blurred distance. The suspects walked in an uneasy cluster, each armoured in winter coats and varying degrees of internal defence. It was here, beneath the quiet disguise of a winter garden, that Miss Marple laid the groundwork for confrontation, not with accusation, but story. Miss Marple's deductive assembly colonel. She began, voice mild but carrying easily in cold air. "Your cousin Gerald died shortly after the war, did he not?" "Yes." The colonel said, "Poor fellow, never recovered his vigour." "And he entrusted you with estate documents?" "Well, some were kept here, but no one has looked at them in years." "Except Mr. Wrath," she replied, "who did not look for documents, but confirmation." Edmund frowned. Clara's breath caught audibly in the cold. The doctor's eyes sharpened. Iris looked puzzled but thoughtful. Wrath's absence loomed large. Miss Marple continued, "Wrath declined sugar because someone else requested saccharin for him, someone who had prepared poison sweet enough not to require additional masking. The request was not his. It was designed to isolate his cup from the tray." Nolan nodded slowly. Opportunity by separation. Exactly, she said. She paused, letting the silence knit itself around them. The letter hidden by Miss Fletcher was intended to conceal blackmail, not guilt. Guilt hides handwriting, not envelopes. Blackmail hides envelopes, not handwriting. Iris blinked. Then I was used. Not maliciously, she said kindly, merely narratively. Her gaze travelled to Clara Hawthorne, whose gloved hand was clenched tightly now around nothing at all. The photograph of Roth in the gallery weeks earlier was taken by someone who wished to record his presence, not his research. Research threatens documents. Presence threatens succession. Clara met her eyes at last. The glance was sharp, cold, and revelatory. "You know," Clara said. "Oh, yes," said Miss Marple. "I have known since you described the argument, but not its substance. Only one sort of dispute involves ethics, secrets, inheritance, and a doctor asked to look the other way, extortion, and extortion involves deadlines. Boxing Day, I believe." Clara said nothing. "Which makes tomorrow," Miss Marple continued, "the perfect time for a confrontation someone wished to prevent entirely. The truth was poised now, quivering on the edge of revelation like a bell about to toll. Murder had not been committed to protect inheritance, but to protect the belief that inheritance was still possible at all, and Clara Hawthorne, who feared being made small by someone else's future, was about to learn that older ladies never fear looking too closely at the cracks in snow. Snow has a talent for hush, but not for permanence. By the morning of 27 December, a faint thaw had begun at Thornley Green's edges. Icicles wept discreetly from gutters, gravel glimmered damply where frost once reigned, and the hush of winter felt less like secrecy and more like expectation. Indoors at Briarstone Manor, the hush had changed again, no longer stunned or speculative, but taut, alert, and braced for the small clearing of throats that precedes the shattering of illusions. Miss Jane Marple, who had long ago made peace with the fact that truth rarely arrives on schedule, yet always arrives in character, requested the West Gallery be reopened for one final assembly. The Colonel obliged, baffled but dutiful, while P.C. Nolan, notebook at the ready, seemed privately resigned to the fact that detection was less about boot prints and more about tea habits than he had once been trained to believe. The gallery, stripped now of its unbroken innocence, awaited them. The garlands still hung upon the banister, but the gap where florist's wire had sagged now looked almost theatrical in hindsight, a set piece for misdirection. The Christmas tree, replenished by servants who had decided a manor without cheer, was a kind of crime of its own, twinkled gamely near the hearth. A new red bauble hung there, not Roth's, of course. This one was whole, harmless, and uninvested with metaphor. The suspects gathered, fewer now in confidence than in number. Clara Hawthorne, pale, controlled, and braced, stood nearest the staircase, as though positioning herself for judgment or perhaps geography. Edmund Hawthorne hovered beside her, expression professionally sombre, but personally stormed. There is a difference, and the difference was guiltless but turbulent. Dr. Carrington entered last, composed once more in her physician's reserve, though this time without the sheen of someone holding silence hostage. Iris Fletcher lingered near Miss Marple herself, earnest, shaken, and resolved to learn detection by apprenticeship if necessary. The Colonel, centre stage without knowing the script, looked from face to face like a man attempting to recall where the game pieces were before the board was overturned. Miss Marple, who had no intention of overturning the board without first narrating the play, began. "The true motive, my dear Colonel," she said, "you were quite correct in one thing. This tragedy did begin at Christmas, but it did not begin at the stairs, nor at the tea, nor even at the painting." The Colonel blinked. "Then where the devil did it begin? In a promise, she replied, a promise made long ago and weaponized only recently. She explained Jasper Roth had not simply uncovered a hidden signature beneath the Winter Queen. He had also discovered, within the East Tower desk, proof that the painting was stolen wartime contraband, smuggled into Briarstone by the late Gerald Bantry, Fell, the Colonel's cousin. The theft had been an act of war, born opportunism, entrusted to Lydia Carrington as a deathbed confidence. Carrington kept the promise for years, believing it inert, historical, and sealed by mortality itself. Roth, however, recognized the painting not as heirloom but evidence, and attempted to extort the silence Dr. Carrington had sworn to uphold, using exposure as leverage against succession. The threat was designed to destabilize Edmund's inheritance, not to enrich Roth's collection, which is where Clara Hawthorne stepped into the narrative, not as accomplice to extortion, but enemy of belief. Clara intercepted Roth's plan not because she wished Roth silent, but because she wished Edmund, believing inheritance was still assured. If Edmund suspected contraband in the estate, his ambitions would recalculate. If he believed himself secure, he would inherit a house already mortgaged by secret, not suspicion. Murder, she continued, was not committed to protect a legacy, but to protect certainty itself, a far more fragile heirloom. The method Clara Hawthorne had prepared Roth's tea herself, not by serving it, but by forging the request that isolated his cup from the tray. She slipped the compound into the saccharine tin, not the sugar bowl, knowing Roth would decline additional sweetener if told saccharine was prearranged. The scent of bitter almonds was faint enough to be blamed on gallery polish, florist's wire, or memory itself, unless one knew to sniff for it. The tower key had been hidden to delay discovery of documents until Edmund's succession was emotionally secured. The photograph had been staged weeks earlier to establish Roth's presence as curiosity, not threat. And Iris Fletcher's concealment of the blackmail letter had been anticipated, not as obstacle but timetable adjustment. A murder assembled like a house party, invitations forged, preferences edited, timing weaponized, and truth trapped as tragedy. Confrontation and confession, you see, said Miss Marple, turning to Clara at last. You were not protecting inheritance, but belief, and belief is a dangerous thing to guard. One begins trimming garlands and ends trimming lives. Clara exhaled. It was not a sigh, it was punctuation. Yes, she said quietly, I did it. Edmund stiffened, not with accusation, but betrayal's private mathematics. Clara, you wanted Briarstone, Miss Marple observed gently. Clara wanted you certain you still could. Only one of those motives kills. Clara's control did not crumb, but only certainty did. Murder had been her final wire in the garland of protection. Justice without spectacle. P.C. Nolan escorted Clara away without spectacles. No, prefers quiet endings, and so do English villages. Dr. Carrington, whose old promise had been misinterpreted as complicity, supplied London laboratory confirmation later that week. The compound matched exactly what Miss Marple already knew by scent, habit, and behaviour. The painting's theft, now confirmed, was handled discreetly by estate lawyers who understood that scandal may crack stonework, but murder cracks foundations entirely. The Colonel's ward would inherit, but inherit something rewritten by truth, not threat. Calm restored Thornley Green, bracing, thawing, and adjusting its Christmas posture toward the new year, absorbed the affair as villages absorb snow, with commentary, resilience, and eventual melting. The choir sang again at St. Leonard's Church that Sunday, voices stronger now that secrets were no longer conducting them. The tree lights twinkled uninvestigatively. The gallery stairs, swept at last, returned to architecture rather than narrative device. Miss Marple, seated in the drawing-room before her departure, resumed her knitting with contented diligence. The Colonel poured sherry and attempted a philosophical flourish. "Well, Miss Marple, mysteries always melt eventually, eh?" she smiled, needles clicking. "Only the false ones, Colonel, only the false ones."